Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Everybody can hear me, can't you?
Yes.
Well, continuing with Exodus this morning, Exodus chapter 5, and we're at the place where Moses and Aaron have their first interview, I suppose we might call it, with Pharaoh. So I'm going to read Exodus chapter 5 1 to 23, which is the entire chapter. So brace up for it. It takes a little while to do. So we start off. Afterwards, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people away from their work? Get back to your burdens." And Pharaoh said, "Behold, the people of the land are now many, and you make them rest from their burdens." The same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people and their foremen, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as in the past. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the number of bricks that they made in the past you shall impose on them. You shall by no means reduce it, for they are idle. Therefore they cry, 'Let us go and offer sacrifice to our God.' Let heavier work be laid on the men, that they may labour at it, and pay no regard to lying words." So the taskmasters and the foremen of the people went out and said to the people, "Thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go and get straw yourselves whenever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced in the least." So the people were scattered throughout the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. The taskmasters were urgent, saying, "Complete your work, your daily task each day as when there was straw." And the foremen of the people of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten and were asked, "Why have you not done all your task of making bricks today and yesterday as in the past?" Then the foreman of the people of Israel came and cried to Pharaoh, "Why do you treat your servants like this? No straw is given to your servants, yet they say to us, 'Make bricks.' And behold, your servants are beaten, but the fault is yours and your own people." But he said, you're idle, that is why you say, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Go now and work. No straw will be given you, but you must still deliver the same number of bricks." The foreman of the people of Israel saw that they were in trouble when they said, "You shall no means reduce your number of bricks, your daily task each day." They met Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them as they came out from Pharaoh. And they said to them, "The Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Then Moses turned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." So that went well, didn't it? Okay. When I was working in IT, I was reading this and it reminded me, I used to do a lot of project work. I'd join up with a team of people for a while, anything from 5 to say 30 people. We'd be given a budget, a deadline, and we'd be expected at the end of it to produce a working IT system. That was the theory. And these projects would always start out with a high degree of optimism. We'd have an initial meeting, we'd make the plans, we'd look at the budget, we'd decide who was doing what, and it was all rather lovely and wonderful and pally and friendly. And then as time went on, it started to change a bit. The user would change their mind sometimes. We'd notice that we were running out of money rather quickly. We'd notice that there were some team members that would perhaps like to put on another project. Factions would form. We'd have emergency progress meetings. And if it really went wrong, the project manager would be replaced. And the acrimony and the blame and the sort of shame of this would like sit on us as a project team. Didn't always work like that, but this would be very typical. And it reminded me so much of Exodus chapter 5. They went in, Moses had been assured that God would be with him, given him Aaron to help he could perform some supernatural feats to impress Pharaoh about the authority he had and the authority of Yahweh, the Hebrew God. Moses had spoken to the Hebrew elders and they'd been won over. They were all delighted and they worshipped God together. And so they went to Pharaoh's court all full of optimism. And the request they were asking for, there's nothing unusual about that. There's recorded instances of slaves being given time out to go and worship in the wilderness. They wanted to do this because the Egyptians embodied their gods in so many different animals that it would look to the Egyptians as though they were trying to insult their gods if they started slaughtering them. So that's why they wanted to do it. But Pharaoh was having absolutely none of that. Just as a bit of background, we know a little bit about this Pharaoh. He was the son of Ramesses II. He was a powerful, successful Pharaoh who brought unity, brought prosperity, and he brought a good military presence to Egypt. And it was a good time under him. But this was his son. He was very, very different. All the pharaohs believed that they were children of the sun god Ra. They believed they had special access to them. They used to sit in the temples and accept the worship of the people. But this son of Ramesses II, it went straight to his head. He was a really weak, vain, prideful pharaoh. First thing he did on his reign, there's a neighbouring nation going to invade them. And he said, he said, the gods have told me I'm not to join in with this, that he's going to bless you generals as you go. So he went and sat in the temple. And when the generals came back, he took all the credit for it. That's the kind of guy he was. So he absolutely refused and engaged in an act of vindictiveness as well, to tell them to go. And the straw normally delivered, they'd chop it up, put it in the bricks, that would bind the bricks together. This time, it was April, and it was just after the harvest. And usually in Egypt, there'd be a really scorching wind blowing for the next 40 days, and nobody went out into the fields anymore. All that was left was stubble, so they had to fan out through the land, they had to pull the stubble up, and they had to hopefully get enough to make the bricks, which they couldn't do. So it was a real act of nastiness on the part of this pharaoh to do this. Just to make sure they understood, when they failed in their brick quotas, they obviously started beating the slaves. And this is something else that's recorded as well. It was quite normal for these beatings would take place publicly. They'd line up the Hebrew overseers, and one by one lay them down and beat them with rods and whips in front of all the other Hebrew slaves, just to teach them a lesson. So Pharaoh blames Moses, the overseers blame Moses, the Hebrew slaves blame Moses, and Moses blames God. So it's all going horribly wrong at the moment, it really is. So what I'd like to do this morning, I want to make 4 points from this about obeying God, sincerely doing his will, and when it all seems to go wrong for us. Who knows in the future what we might be called to do as a fellowship, and we need to be aware that I think times things do not go well, even though we're in God's will. So the first one is, and it's a pretty obvious one I guess, is trust in obedience no matter what the results. I used to think that obedience to God meant I would lead a very nice sort of Christian life, I'd have no problems. And I used to catalogue it at times, like, am I obeying God in this and this and this? And yeah, I think I am, so it should be okay. Nothing awful is going to happen to me today. But I'm looking back now, I wonder what Bible I was reading. It says nothing of the sort. In our chapter, Moses, despite his initial reluctance, went ahead with the blessing of the Hebrew elders and the assurances of God. And yes, but God also told him that Pharaoh's heart would be hardened. But I don't think for 1 minute Moses thought this was going to happen. My model for obedience in the New Testament, of course, is the Apostle Paul. He was a man, he certainly knew all about being obedient and about it all going horribly wrong as well. He was whipped, stoned, shipwrecked, dragged out of the city, and in the end ended up in prison in Rome, and ended up getting executed as well. And this was a man who obeyed God. It says in 2 Timothy 3:10-11, "You, however, have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, and my steadfastness. My persecutions and sufferings that happened to me at Antioch, at Iconium and at Lystra, which persecutions I endured. Yet from all of them the Lord rescued me. Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." He had certainly a different view of serving the Lord than I did when I was a young Christian. But he also, in his sufferings, he found a deep joy and peace and confidence. We don't have to read the prison epistles, don't we? Colossians, Ephesians, those wonderful lyrical books, letters that are about the love of Christ. And he wrote them from prison under threat of execution. So he really found something there, that in all his troubles and trials and problems, he knew he was being obedient. He said there's a crown of righteousness laid up for me, waiting for me. And he had a certainty about his calling to God, and he followed it despite what happened to him. So we're to trust in God, in obedience, no matter what the results. And I've got to say, I'm not saying that is something he's a person who's done that a tremendous amount in my Christian life. I've had a lot of up and downs, Margaret and I have. Sometimes I've held it together and trusted God, and sometimes I've fallen apart and done what Moses did and blamed God for it. So we're not to let the results of our obedience, if they're negative, to lessen our trust in God. He's still there, he's still in charge, he still knows the outcome, and everything's in his hand. We've got to be clear, I think, about the sort of God we serve. He's not a big benevolent uncle. He's not a Santa Claus. He doesn't tend to work to formulas as well. He doesn't say, if you do A, B, C, I will give you X, Y, Z. Not in terms of this life, he doesn't, for sure. So let's leave the last word with Jesus on this. He said, "I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world." And number 2, trust that God's going to be faithful in his timing, not our timing. There are times in my life when I think God is never in a hurry to do anything. He has this dreadful patience, it seems to me. I mean, it's taken 80 years to get Moses to Pharaoh's court. And when Moses stood there, it had been more than 1,000 years ago that God had made his initial promises to Abraham. And here they were, just about to take place, it seems. And as Christians, how long have we been waiting for Christ to come again? 2,000 years. That's a long time, isn't it? It really is. Well, Moses already had an experience of jumping the gun. It cost him 40 years of his life, for starters, acting as a wandering shepherd in the desert. And as far as Egypt went, God had been clear to him, I think, that it was not going to be quick and it was not going to be easy. He'd said that Pharaoh was going to harden his heart. So instead of taking this and trusting that God would get these slaves out of Egypt, he joined them, jumped on the bandwagon, got frustrated with God, felt he was blamed for everything, and blamed God, and ended up saying, "You seem to be quite, you seem to like to do, I never wanted this job in the first place anyway. I told you to send somebody else." So there we go. But I wonder why they were so surprised and so frustrated and so angry and so resentful. It had all been laid out to them. God had told Moses Pharaoh wouldn't let them go without Pharaoh being compelled. God would have to strike Egypt with plagues and pestilences. That God, would have to bring judgment on Pharaoh in the end through Pharaoh's firstborn son, which we know about. Well, then, but I'm not a Hebrew slave. I've not been working hours, years in scorching brick fields, being beaten and criticised and leading this poverty-stricken life. I think on the whole, I have a lot more sympathy for the slaves than I do for Moses himself. But they all wanted to be free, they all wanted to be delivered, preferably next week, and they had to wait on God to perform and bring about his promises. And I think this is a common experience for all of us. I think all of us are waiting in some way for God to do something in our lives, maybe save a family member. I'm waiting for our son for that great and glorious day when he gets saved. It's been 35 years I've been waiting now. Healing, a job, maybe being called into a ministry. There are so many things that we're waiting on God when we believe he's given a promise to us. But waiting like this is doing something inside of us. I'm not saying, I think the point at times is that God wants us to wait, and it's not so much he can't bring about the promises made or he's having trouble or difficulty, but he's quite happy to delay, because of that delay causes him and allows him to do a work inside of us. The point is in the waiting, not in the fulfilment of a promise, if you see what I mean. And I think with these Hebrews, God was starting to teach them some lessons about himself, about his character, about their life, about how he operated, how he worked. It was far more than Pharaoh just being an awkward cuss and God was going to sort him out. That's not the point of this story at all. It's about God showing his power, his glory, his authority, and teaching these Hebrew slaves to trust him and to let him do a work amongst them in that time. So I think our waiting should teach him many times painfully to learn to trust God more and to come to him. Part of it is our desperation, our prayer life, our begging, our wanting him to do something, our being disappointed for him. For me, at times it's been like a roller coaster ride. But at the end of it, when God fulfills his promise, all the glory goes to him. It's absolutely amazing. And looking back, I realise how much I've learnt about myself and about God. And I think this is what he was doing with the Hebrew nation at that time. Next one, number 3, don't expect to be popular. This man, Moses, who came in like the Lone Ranger and he was going to deliver Israel, and God was on his side, suddenly was unpopular. That's a mild word. I think hated would be more like it. But I can imagine them waiting, expectantly outside this interview with Pharaoh, and he was going to come out and say, okay folks, let's pack up and let's be off, but he didn't. He came out and their brick quota had been increased and they had to get their own straw. Church we attended many years ago in Chesterfield decided to employ a youth pastor, and there's some mixed feelings. I thought he was a good youth pastor myself, and one thing he did, he started to bring in young kids to church. There was an estate near us. It was quite not a good estate, it was quite big and had a lot of troubles, violence and problems, and he started to bring some kids there, bring them to church. They were a bit different from the usual sort of kids. They were gathering a bunch outside before the service started on a Sunday and have a fag, for instance. They had a service once and they decided that these young kids could pick 2 songs. So they did. They picked 2 Christian heavy metal numbers. it was funny. Really good. It was so different. Bless their heart. That's how they saw life. That was it. And a deputation of outraged parents decided they would pay a visit to the minister and complain about this. And they didn't say get rid of these kids, but they said, can these kids have their own Sunday school and our children can have theirs so we can keep them apart? It's amazing, isn't it? But that's what happened. And this youth pastor who was following his calling, following what he really sincerely believed Jesus was telling him to do, was suddenly unpopular in the church for doing it. And Moses was learning exactly the same kind of lesson. Being obedient, following his calling, wasn't going to make him popular. I'm not talking about being obnoxious, overbearing, arrogant, that will make anybody unpopular. And I'm not talking about acting like a man with a mission, who if everybody's not doing what he's doing is a pew warmer and is lukewarm. And I've done that in the past. I've thought that as a young Christian. I was called out, I felt called out to do street evangelism, a thing a lot of Christians don't like doing. So I decided that they were all lukewarm, pew warmers and weren't committed. And, well, you know the kind of story, don't you? So there we are. But thankfully, God brought me out of that, told me a few untruths about myself. I took a different view. But we never know the effect of our calling on our church, on the Christians we know, even on the population of people that God's calling us to. And it might be an adverse one. We might not be hailed as this wonderful Christian who's doing this wonderful ministry amongst us in the church or out there. We've got something we've got to be prepared for. So what we can do is take comfort that there are plenty of people in the Bible who had this experience, that were called by God, and it made them very unpopular. We're in very good company with that. Lastly, we're called to be God's ambassadors, not his marketing department. I was saved in the early 1980s after listening to it, an uncompromising gospel message by a Maori evangelist. Norman Taffy was his name, 5'0", and he stood there in front of probably 250 people on this outreach. And his concluding words were, if you do not give your life to Christ tonight, there is a chair in hell and it's got your name on it. Now that's an interesting slant, isn't it, on giving the gospel? But it's true enough though, isn't it? You could have heard a pin drop. Well, I'm thankful for that man and his willingness to preach the good news, but also the bad news as well. This was a time when evangelists, when they made an altar call at the end, the message would be sort of, come to Jesus, your life will be a lot better, he will solve all your problems, it'll all be wonderful, etc., etc. And I was glad I never heard that gospel or responded to it. If I did, I might have been one of the people who walked away from Christ, the church, and other Christians when, after they'd received Christ as Saviour, their lives started to unravel. 2 Corinthians 5:20 says, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We're not called to be palatable, and we're not called to be popular. You can easily build up a church if you use the right marketing ploys, but we're not called to do that. This Jesus who we're promised will solve all our problems, who is lovely, who is forgiving, who is gracious, who is merciful, who is all these things, is also the same person who says, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. Same Jesus, same part of the message. We're to give the whole message. This is what we're doing, representing what God is saying through Christ to an unbelieving world in this case. I suspect, and I hope I'm not doing Moses an injustice, I think he tried to sell the idea a bit too vigorously. I think he put the emphasis on being free rather than the difficulties of getting free and what it meant to serve God. It says back in chapter 4, Exodus 4:31, and the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. I wonder if he really did tell them that Pharaoh was going to resist them vigorously. Pharaoh was going to put a wedge between the elders and Moses and Aaron and the Hebrew slaves. Whether he's going to give them a heavier burden than ever before, whether he's going to beat them. I don't think he did. The message was, we're going to be free, and it's going to be soon. It's all going to happen. Well, perhaps not. Conclusion. There's no need for us to worry about what God might call us to do and how we might run into problems and adversity because we're being obedient. It is in God's hands. He will bring about the end result, not us. He's working through us. It's not depending on us to sell what he's God to anybody at all, but to proclaim it. If we're following God's calling, He'll take care of fulfilling it through us, whatever happens. So let's end on 2 Corinthians 4:16-18. So we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are seen are eternal. And I think in all fulfilling our calling, our ministries to God, whatever they are, we've got to keep our eyes on the eternal. Whatever God's doing in our lives and the lives of those people we're called to serve has eternal consequences, and we won't see it till we stand in glory at the bema seat of Christ. Thank you.